Well, we'll go ahead and get started. It's about 10:15 now. Good morning, everyone. I'm Elvia Malagon. I'm a reporter with the Chicago Sun-Times, and I'll be moderating today's panel discussion on federal FOIA law. We have three really sharp um, and experts in FOIA law, so hopefully they will be able to help you guys with any questions or issues that you guys are currently navigating. I'll introduce our three panelists. The first one you might be familiar with if you watched yesterday's keynote. Ron Nixon is the acclaimed global investigations editor for the Associated Press. Nixon has mastered the use of public records and reporting throughout his distinguished career, which has featured stops in Mexico, Rwanda, Senegal, Nigeria, and Belgium. And Nixon previously served as a Homeland Security correspondent for the New York Times. Our other panelist is Alexandra Perloff Giles. Alexandra is an attorney at Gibson, Dunn and Crusher, where she specializes in media, entertainment, and technology issues. And she is also an adjunct professor at Columbia University. She is appointed to the Freedom of Information Act Federal Advisory Committee for the years 2020 through 2022. And she previously worked in-house at the New York Times, where she managed the Times FOIA docket, litigated libel suits, and advised journalists on news gathering issues. Our third panelist today is Adam Marshall, who is a senior staff attorney at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. His work there includes federal and state public records litigation, writing amicus briefs, and training journalists. Adam has also been named a Forbes 30 Under 30 in media for his work on promoting government transparency, including the development of the FOIA Wiki. Adam is also the co-author of a chapter on the Federal Freedom of Information Act in Troubling Transparency. He also wrote a chapter on public records in COVID-19, the legal challenges, and he has a JD from the George Washington University Law School. So the format of how this panel will go, just for everyone who's watching, is our three panelists are going to share. Some of them have some slides to share with you all. And then after that, we'll go into a Q&A. And if this is your first panel that you're attending, even though we're not together on the same Zoom, there should be a chat window to the right of you where you could submit any questions, and then those questions will get to us, and we should have a good amount of time to answer any. And also, it's my understanding that this will be recorded, so if there's any information that you want to look back on, you should be able to have access to that link just in case later on you want to go back and kind of look at what some of the panelists talked about. So Ron, if you want to get us started.
Yes. So good morning to everybody. Thanks for attending the panel. I understand that we have a captive audience, so can't really go anywhere. But actually, no, welcome, and I hope that you guys will learn quite a bit from this panel. So I am going to really talk about how to get and identify records for a federal FOIA. So more about the process for figuring out what it is that you want. And my fellow panelists, who are both attorneys, can tell you more about the legal aspect of FOIA. I will leave that to experts. So let me just share my screen here. Okay. Apologies, give me a quick second here. Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Okay. There we go. Sorry. So the title of my presentation here is called Going the Offensive with FOIA, which I talked about a little bit in my keynote last night. And I want to elaborate a little bit more on what I mean by that. And going on the offensive means that, we need to be more actively using FOIA to root out the data, documents, and other information, rather than waiting for some event to happen before we file a request. So how do we use FOIA typically is that we get records we know about, we get data documents after big events, and we follow up with a tip. This, though, is being more systematic to break news before it's news and to also identify some hidden gems. First thing I want to talk about are, identifying data documents and things out there. One of the best ways of doing that is looking at the forms that federal agencies keep and understanding the information that they collect on the public. One of the best places for this is the White House Office of Management and Budget, Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. I know that's a mouthful, but by law, federal agencies have to get approval from the OMB whenever they collect the same or similar information on 10 or more people from the public. So that information, they have to identify what's being collected, the reason why they're collecting it, and the times and the cost to the public for that request. So this search here at reginfo.gov is really a collection of all the forms that the federal agency keeps, understanding that this is the data that you want. You can search it by, if you know the OMB control number, which most of us don't, but if you know the agency or the sub-agency, so I would go in and search Department of Homeland Security or Customs and Border Protection and ICE, and it will give me all of those forms. Again, that is giving you a roadmap for the data that, or forms or reports that are out there that you want. So this is an example of a form. I just took this one because I covered Department of Homeland Security. This is a Customs and Border Protection protest form. If you got something, you imported into the US, it was seized, you have an opportunity, or shippers have an opportunity to go and protest that. But you can see the information that's being collected here. So if I'm filing a FOIA, I know exactly what to ask for. I could either ask for all the information that's collected under this particular form, or the database, or what have you. So this again gives you an idea. Instead of casting about for documents and data, this gives you more specifics. The other thing is what's called a systems of records notice. And this is a group or any group of records that are under control of an agency from which the information is retrieved by the name of an individual or some identifying number such as a social security number. So each agency has to post their notice of these systems of records to the Federal Register. You then go in and you can see here, I've pulled up the system of record notices for the Department of Homeland Security. So you can go for each one of these sub-agencies and see all the systems of record notices that they're collecting. I'll give you an example of how I use that in a second here. The last thing in this section is privacy impact assessments. So a PIA, a privacy impact assessment, is these are used by agencies to mitigate any privacy risk, and they notify the public like what's being collected about you, why is it being collected about you, and then how is it being used and safeguarded, and how is it being stored. So just a quick thing here in reading one of these, I found a great story about a TSA watch list that nobody knew about. I mean, okay, TSA with a watch list, right? TSA can barely get you through security. So why does TSA need a watch list? But it was going through this, managed to find a story out of this just by using the system of record notices and seeing it in the Federal Register. Record retention schedules, I mentioned these last night. These are schedules or forms that agencies have to fill out to say how long they're supposed to keep a record. Like emails are supposed to be kept a certain amount of time. It tells you the form that they're supposed to be kept in. But again, it is a listing of all the documents that that agency keeps. This one is from my state here of Maryland, by the Maryland State Archives. Most places it's done by the archives. Some places it's the Secretary of State. FOIA logs, again, I talked about this a little bit last night too. Federal agencies are required to post their FOIA logs on their websites so you can see what other people have requested. Yes, there's some stuff in there from journalists, but I'm not trying to keep tabs on my fellow journalists. I'm just trying to see what other people have requested and gotten, so that if I request the same information, the agency can't come back and tell me, oh, well, it's going to charge, I got to charge you like $20,000 because, you know, we have to get people to find it and put it together. But if you've already done that, then it's kind of hard to make that argument that you need to make all of these resources to fill my request. So agency FOIA logs are also really crucial in helping you identify documents that are out there. But wait, there's more. One final thing here is the GAO. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of the Government Accountability Office. It is a great resource. They put out the little reports on everything. The problem with the GAO is that the GAO is part of Congress, and Congress is not subject to FOIA, right? But there is a way around it. The GAO has its own regulation that allows them to give you information if you cite this regulation, which I've listed here. So it's a great resource of getting access to the documents and data that go into creating those GAO reports. And I know we've all seen those reports. They do a lot of stuff on the state and local level, looking at the federal programs, local and state programs that are funded by federal dollars, because that's their jobs, to go in and audit and make sure that these programs are working as needed. And a lot of people have gotten tips to do investigative pieces out of this. So that is it for me. I hope that I stay within the time frame. This is my contact information. If anybody wants to, talk further about this, hope this was helpful. And I'm sure that you'll post things in the Q&A section once we get to that. So with that, I will yield my time.
Amanda, sorry, Alexandra, do you want to take it from here?
Sorry. Okay. Hello, everyone. Delighted to be with you this morning. I will pick up. That was a true prose guide to FOIA. I think a lot of times, I think what it highlights is that FOIA is part of your reporting, and the more prep you can do to figure out what records you're looking for, the more success you will have with FOIA. And then the reporting happens also on the back end when you get a redacted document and you're trying to figure out what's under those redactions. So I hope that everyone sees FOIA as sort of a piece of the reporting process and not a standalone endeavor. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the legal aspects, what FOIA is. So FOIA is celebrating its 55th birthday this year. Here's President Johnson on signing FOIA. Democracy works best when the people have all the information that the security of the nation permits. Sounds very grandiose, and we imagine that it's, a tool for journalists to shed light on what's happening. In practice, it's used in a lot of other ways. In particular, I'm interested in this big section that is individuals. Margaret Kwok has written a lot about first-person FOIA. I know there's a panel on FOIA and immigration. Part of the reason you see huge backlogs there is because it's also the way that individuals get their own records about their own immigration history. So this breakdown depends on the agency. This is, sort of across the board, but it just shows you that the news media is actually quite a small percentage of FOIA. So go out there and use FOIA for what it was intended. So as I said, philosophy of disclosure, sort of very broad presumption of access under the law, with a few exceptions. As Ron noted, Congress is out, the courts, the White House itself, not subject to FOIA, state and local agencies, that's covered by state freedom of information laws. And this last point, I think, is important, that the agency doesn't have an obligation to make records for you. So if you were asking them for information, they might know the information, but if it's not compiled in a form, they are going to put it together for you. You're only asking for records that exist somewhere out there. So I'll run through the 9 exemptions. These are all in the statute, and I'll give a little bit of color based on cases that I litigated at the Times or elsewhere related to these. So the first, exemption 1, if you're a national security reporter, you are no doubt familiar with this exemption. This covers classified information. I mentioned that you might get a LOMAR response. That's when the agency says we can neither confirm nor deny whether we have any responsive records, right? So if you FOIA the CIA, something like that, you might encounter this. So I recently did a brief on behalf of Senator Wyden and Representative Malinowski in support of the release under FOIA of the Office of Director of National Intelligence report about the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. That's an example where the Office of the Director of National Intelligence asserted exemption 1, saying this was classified. In this case, the senator and the representative have seen the report and they can say, you know, based on their national security experience, we don't think it needs to be withheld, at least in full. So that's an example of exemption 1. Exemption 2 is personnel records. So, you know, you don't get to find out where there's the parking spot for the employee of whatever agency and what time their lunch break is and that kind of thing. That's what exemption 2 is sort of supposed to be about. Exemption 3 is information that is exempted from disclosure by some other statute. So you see this also in the national security context, the National Security Act. But there are a couple of other examples that you see here of statutes that exempt things from FOIA. So, you know, you will have provisions in statutes enacted since FOIA saying that records are not subject to FOIA. Exemption 4 has become big recently. That covers trade secrets and confidential commercial or financial information. There's been a recent Supreme Court litigation about this that has narrowed the scope of this. This is something that we litigated at the Times in a couple different contexts. I'll give you one example. A reporter requested the VW monitor report. So after the Dieselgate scandal, right, VW was subject to a monitorship, and the monitor produced a report that was submitted to DOJ. And the agency said it was confidential commercial information that could not be released. So that case is ongoing, but that's one example of the kind of information that you know, agencies might assert exemption 4 for. Exemption 5 has blown up and has become, in my view, the most problematic exemption. And this covers most notably what's called the deliberative process privilege. So the idea there is to protect the candor of agency discussions, right? You want junior people to be able to make recommendations without this kind of chilling effect that everything will be exposed. But it has just gotten extraordinarily broad. So recently, the, I think 2016 FOIA Improvement Act tried to cabin this and say that agencies have to show that disclosure would actually cause harm. That's the foreseeable harm standard. And that is, courts are starting to sort of put real teeth in that. So we'll see where that goes, but that's exemption 5. Exemption 6 is the personal privacy exemption. So often you'll have, you know, phone numbers redacted in records that you get, that sort of thing. Exemption 7 is the law enforcement exemption. So it has various subparts, but essentially if it interferes with law enforcement activities in certain ways. So for example, the Times filed suit for a bunch of Epstein related records about who visited Epstein in jail in his last days, that kind of thing. Both exemption 6 and exemption 7 are an issue in that case. Exemption 8 is certain kinds of bank financial records, and exemption 9, geological wells. That does not come up very often. Just to sort of wrap up, this is what I said at the beginning, you know, figure out what you're looking for and where it's kept. And then describe the records like you're speaking to a human. Remember that it is a human officer on the other side. Treat them like you would a source, butter them up, get to know them, pick up the phone and talk to them, and make their lives easy. Give them a range that they can search for, keywords that they can search for. Don't use words like, you know, including but not limited to. I don't know what that means if I'm trying to create a keyword search. So the more specific you can be about what you're asking for. Ask for a fee waiver as members of the news media. If you can show that what you're reporting is going to contribute to public understanding, you should not be paying vast sums for your records. Expedited processing. As many of you know, it can be a very long process to get FOIAs. The State Department, if you submit a FOIA now, they'll say, yes, very nice, we'll get back to you in 2024. If you can show that you're entitled to expedited processing, that helps. So if you're tethering it to some upcoming event like an election or something like that, and you can show that there is real urgency to inform the public about something. If you get expedited processing, you're in a different queue. So, for the agencies, they're prioritizing different requests. There's ordinary requests, there's the expedited processing queue, and then there's the litigation queue. So sometimes you sue if they haven't given you any kind of response in 20 days, just to move things along more quickly. And here's, what to do if you aren't getting a response. Pick up the phone and speak to an officer. Often, that helps if they know that you're paying attention and waiting for the records, and you can figure out what the holdup is. Do they not understand the request? Can you narrow the scope in some way? It's not in your interest to have it drawn out over 6 years any more than it is in their interest. You can file an administrative appeal if you are denied, or if you disagree with redactions or anything like that. And then you can, of course, file a lawsuit. As I said, either if they haven't produced anything at all, or if they have withheld responsive records. So happy to answer any questions about sort of more details of FOIA, but that's sort of the big picture overview of what is covered, and I'll turn it over to Adam.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Alexandra. Hi, everyone. As was said, my name is Adam Marshall. I'm an attorney at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. I hope you all know who we are. And you've used us, but if not, we're a nonprofit based in DC. We are a bunch of lawyers that basically work for journalists and newsrooms around the country. We provide free legal assistance and resources. And I want to talk about some of those now to tie together some of the tips and tricks that you heard from Ron rather, and also Alexandra. So I am also going to share my screen. And let's see if I can do this. All right, so I did a little bit of a poll to see how many of you had filed federal FOIAs before. It actually looks like the majority of you, at least in the poll, have not filed a federal FOIA. So I have a great resource for you. It is the FOIA Wiki. What is the FOIA Wiki? It's exactly what it sounds like. It's Wikipedia, but for the federal FOIA. This is a tool that I created, and since lots of other journalists and orgs have joined in expanding out, it has all kinds of really cool stuff in it. So, for example, if you are new to FOIA, like a lot of you are, there's a FOIA basics page. It has, a lot of the background that we were talking about before. Who does FOIA apply to? How to make a request, some of the things that we were talking about previously. And then the timeline for, when to expect different types of things. And what to do, if there's delay or if the agency claims there's an exemption, things that we were just talking about. The FOIA Wiki has pages on literally everything you would want when it comes to the federal FOIA. So for example, if you're interested in doing some FOIAs against the Central Intelligence Agency, there's a page on the CIA, and it has all kinds of stuff in it. And on the right-hand side here, there's this toolbox. And what's really cool about that is it has links to basic information about the agency, some of which Ron was talking about earlier. So for example, if you want to get at the systems of records notices for the CIA, there's a link to it right here, courtesy of FOIA Map, which basically went and got all the SORNs from NARA, and also the record disposition schedules. So all of that is right there. We've got all kinds of information about recent lawsuits. We've got links to their regulations. Where's their FOIA page? All kinds of cool stuff. There's also information about exemptions. So there was, the link to the site is foia.wiki. I saw that in the chat. So there was a question in the chat earlier about, what if I get a B5 claim? How do I challenge that? Well, the answer, as Alexandra said, is you file an administrative appeal. But what do you put in the administrative appeal, right? You need to know a little bit about that. So you can go to exemption 5 page in the FOIA wiki, and it tells you about the exemption. So, the threshold requirement, and then also some of the privileges. So as was said, the deliberative process privilege is probably the most common. So if you click on the deliberative process privilege page, it has all kinds of information with cites to cases about the scope of the exemption and how you go about challenging it, right? So maybe you argue it's not pre-decisional. Maybe you argue that it's been incorporated into the agency's official position, so it can't be withheld anymore. If you're talking about historical records, there's a 25-year sunset, right? So the agency can't cite that anymore. Maybe the information you're seeking is just like data or stats, and so you can go in here and you can say, oh, look, purely factual material, is not generally able to be withheld under the deliberative process privilege. And you can just look at this and you've got a nice little site right there and you can plop that in your administrative appeal. So do check out the FOIA wiki, contribute to it as you learn. And it's hopefully a great resource for everyone. One of the other, I think, common questions that we're getting these days is, how is COVID-19 affecting federal FOIA? And the answer to that is twofold. So on the one hand, the law has not changed at all. The statutory deadline remains fixed. It's generally 20 business days for an agency to provide a determination, and that hasn't changed at all. However, as a practical matter, it is adding to the delay pretty substantially. So we have a page in the FOIA wiki, surprise, that covers this. We have links to all kinds of different agencies, what their current status is, what they were doing kind of earlier in the pandemic, and links to all of that. In some cases, we also have links to declarations and things like that have been filed in court cases to tell you a little bit more about what is going on with that agency. So the long and short of it is the delays that already existed are increasing. Again, just as a practical matter, very upsetting, I think, to reporters and newsrooms all the country. But what are you going to do? One of the other things that I wanted to touch on was, what to expect, given the change in administrations. There was a CJR article that came out a little while ago, looking back at FOIA during the Trump administration and how it really suffered quite badly. So I recommend, if you all are interested in this, the FOIA Project. It's a really great resource coming out of the University of Syracuse that tracks what's happening with FOIA at the federal level in terms of litigation. And if you look at the number of pending FOIA lawsuits over time, so this is 2001 to 2020, you see a trend. The trend is it goes up. And not only does it go up, but it really starts to spike in the last 4 years. There are a lot of reasons for that, but certainly delay and additional denials are part of it. I don't know what to expect from the current administration. I hope that things will get better. There have been some early statements, at least, supporting broad notions of transparency, but the proof really is in the pudding. Generally speaking, FOIA has just gotten worse under every administration. It got worse under George W. Bush, and then it got worse under Barack Obama, and then it got worse under Trump. And it's going to take a lot to reverse those trends. So I'm not terribly optimistic, frankly, absent some massive resource shifting towards federal FOIA offices, that things are going to get better. But I hope that I'm wrong. So with that, we want to be able to leave plenty of time for your all's questions, because that's really the most interesting and helpful thing probably for you than just listening to us blather on. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Elvia.
Thanks, everyone. And I know some people were asking about if PowerPoints were going to be available, and I think we will be able to provide that, and we'll get that all set up to make sure everyone is able to get the PowerPoints. To start off, it looks like there were a couple of questions that came up that maybe Alexandra could take up, because they deal with exemptions. One question asked specifically about exemption number 2, and if that applies to information about applicant hiring demographics.
So I'm not aware of any case specifically about that. I would say, ask for it, and it's possible that they'll assert exemption 2, but I think you have a good case for appealing. I don't think exemption 2 should apply to that kind of information. Exemption 2 is really about sort of workplace conditions, not about that kind of, demographic statistical information. So I would strongly argue that exemption 2 does not apply. It doesn't mean the agency won't try and put it forward, but I don't think exemption properly applies to that kind of information. On exemption 5, I know Adam touched on that a little bit, but exemption there. I should also say there's a Supreme Court case dealing with exemption 5 this term, so it's been argued, I believe, and we haven't gotten the decision yet. That might tell us a little bit more about the scope of exemption 5, but essentially it covers pre-decisional deliberative material. So the biggest thing you can do is say that something is not deliberative, it's factual, right? Any decision is based on some factual record that was put together in order to make the decision. And so you should argue that at a minimum that withholding in full is not appropriate, that they can, only truly pre-decisional deliberative material, and again, in the 2016 FOIA Improvement Act, only where disclosure would actually harm the agency in some way. And I think with all FOIA appeals and litigation, what you really want to do is emphasize the burden that is on the government. There's a presumption of access, and the burden is always on the agency to justify withholding. So make that burden very clear, and it's in their court to satisfy the standards of the new law that is deliberately designed to stop them from overusing exemption 5. And in general, very few people actually file administrative appeals, but that's the level at which you get a lawyer to look at it. Otherwise, it's a FOIA officer who's not usually an attorney. So it is worth doing just to get another set of eyes, and often, is successful. I'll pause there.
And just to add one more point to that, I completely concur with everything that was just said. I think it's really important sometimes to remind agencies about the segregability requirement in the federal FOIA. They can only withhold whatever portions of a record lawfully fall within the scope of an exemption and satisfy the foreseeable harm standard. If there are other parts of the document, even within a page that don't qualify for the exemption, then the entire page can't be withheld. It's a really basic tenet of FOIA, but you'd be shocked at how often, some FOIA offices need to be reminded of that. So if they're like, well, there are 10,000 pages, but, they're all deliberative or whatever, you may need to go back to them or do an administrative appeal and say, well, is every single line of every one of those 10,000 pages really deliberative? Because, I find that hard to believe. Maybe you need to go back and do another review.
Someone submitted a scenario that they're going through, and maybe you guys could help him out with it. A federal agency has basically put my FOIA on hold, citing its ongoing investigation, which does not involve law enforcement. They said the information I'm seeking may not yet be reasonable, but may not yet be releasable, but my request will remain open until it is. Is this allowable, and what should my next steps be? So does anyone kind of want to weigh in on what this person should do next?
I'm happy to start, and then Adam can, or Ron, anyone. So first of all, I don't know what may not yet be releasable means. Either it is or it is not releasable. But you can appeal the constructive denial, and so I would treat that as a constructive denial and try and get it up the chain, as I said, the way an administrative appeal gets you up to a lawyer. Adam?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So there is a law enforcement exemption in the federal FOIA. It's exemption 7. There's lots of pages in the FOIA wiki about it. The kind of threshold requirement for exemption 7 is records compiled for law enforcement purposes. And the law says that they may be withheld if and only if their release would harm a specific law enforcement interest. And those are identified in subparts A through F. So there is an exemption, it's exemption 7A, that says, law enforcement records can be withheld if it would be expected to interfere with law enforcement proceedings. But it's important to remember that the subparts of exemption 7 have to be satisfied as well. So it's not the case that just because there's an ongoing investigation, or even an, whatever they want to say, an open investigation, that doesn't in and of itself allow them to withhold the records. They have to demonstrate that its release would harm one of these interests. So you may want to remind the agency of that, again, either through talking with the FOIA officer or the public liaison, or perhaps if that doesn't work, through doing an administrative appeal. But it's not the case. I know it's true under some state public records laws that the law enforcement investigation exemption is a little bit broader. But at the federal level, they have to demonstrate harm in some way.
And I'll just add, I guess, so the question said which does not involve law enforcement, but then it's not clear to me what exemption the agency is relying on at all. So at a minimum, you want to press them for what exemption they're ostensibly relying upon.
Oh, I totally misread the question.
Go ahead. That would be my thing here, is that, this doesn't even cite what exemption they're relying on, because they're saying it's not a law enforcement exemption. So what exactly, what kind of, there's no other exemptions in there for investigations other than law enforcement. So I've never even seen that before.
Yeah, that's kind of weird. I totally misread it. I don't know. So one other thing to know about the federal FOIA, and this is true of a lot of state public records laws as well. Exemption 3, as Alexandra said, basically pulls in other statutes that prohibit the release of information. There are a huge number of B3 statutes in the federal code. We actually don't know how many there are because no one has ever counted. There are probably at least 700 or so. It depends upon how you count. So maybe they're citing one of these other statutes, but my co-panelists are absolutely right. The burden is always on the government to identify the legal basis for allowing them to purportedly withhold information. So you should press them on that.
Okay. Hopefully that was helpful. If the person who submitted the question has any follow-ups, they could feel free to include a follow-up. Another scenario is this person asked, if you're investigating staffing and workplace conditions issues from COVID at an agency, how do you make sure the personnel exemption doesn't hold up your request for records? Does anyone want to tackle that one?
I mean, it's hard to say. It sounds like if you're asking about workplace conditions at an agency, that might well be what is exempt under exemption 2. So, you know, figuring out exactly what you're looking for and how to avoid exemption 2, but exemption 2 will hold that up, and it will prevent the release of certain kinds of information depending on what you're looking at. And we can also talk more broadly about sort of how agencies have dealt with COVID, but that's a slightly separate question.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to that, the personnel files exemption is a little counterintuitive in that in some ways it may be broader than you might think, and in other ways narrower than you might think. It's set forth at exemption 6 of the federal FOIA. If it is cited by the agency to withhold information, one thing that's nice about exemption 6 is it incorporates a balancing test that balances the individual's privacy interest with the public's interest in knowing what the government is doing. So if you run into an exemption 6, you can always file an administrative appeal arguing that the public interest outweighs whatever privacy interest is implicated by the records. And we have examples of different types of public interest that you can argue in the exemption 6 page on the FOIA wiki.
Okay. Another question that we had come up was about exemption 7. So even if you've given dates and other specifics and additional suggestions, verbiage, what do you recommend on including in an appeal?
So the question is sort of how do you best craft the language of an administrative appeal when the denial is based on 7A, I guess. And there are sample administrative appeal letters. So Adam talked about all the resources that Reporters Committee has put out, and they will have very useful language and citations on their FOIA wiki. Muckrock also is an incredible resource for FOIA requests that have been submitted. So you can find sample administrative appeal letters and see which ones look good to you. If you have access to court materials, you can also look at briefs that people have filed in exemption 7A, and that will give you good language to cite. And again, the main thing that I would say in any administrative appeal is emphasize the burden. The presumption is a presumption of access, and it's on the agency to show that, in this case, it will actually interfere with some legitimate law enforcement interest.
And on administrative appeals, just a couple procedural notes. So it was talked about before, the agency, again, in most cases, according to the law, has 20 business days to make a determination with respect to your request. If they make a determination, if they say, yes, here are some things, but not other things, or no, here's nothing at all, you have 90 calendar days then to file your administrative appeal. So just keep that timing in mind, put a little reminder in your calendar, whatever it is, but you have 90 calendar days to file that.
And go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to add something that's not a legal thing, but more of a trick. In going back to what I was saying before, that in some of these cases, what I would do is look to see, particularly with the FOIA logs, to see if that information that you're seeking has already been granted, because there have been numerous cases where I've asked for something, the agency has said it's not responsive or they can't release it. But I looked in the FOIA logs and they've released it to somebody else. So, don't forget to look at those before you actually go in and file. You should still file your appeal, but the information might have been granted to somebody else.
Just one other thing I was going to say, picking up on what Adam said about the 90 days, it's important that you appeal within 90 days also to preserve your right to file a lawsuit. So it is not ripe. Ripeness is a sort of legal doctrine. It is not ripe unless you have exhausted your administrative remedies, i.e. you have filed your administrative appeal if you've been denied. We haven't talked a lot about suing, but I know there are a lot of freelance journalists on this call, and I just want to say that there are ways that you can file a lawsuit, even if you don't have an in-house lawyer. Very, very, very few news organizations have lawyers who have the time to do affirmative public records work anyway. Mostly in-house lawyers are doing vetting for libel and fair use and that kind of thing, and not affirmative access work. There are a large number of law school clinics that have been popping up in recent years that represent freelance journalists at law schools all over the country. There's something called the Gumshoe Project, which connects independent freelance journalists to pro bono attorneys at law firms. So there are resources out there if it's something that you think is really important and worth filing a lawsuit over.
And just to add to that, that's a huge percentage of what we do at the Reporters Committee too. I spend the vast majority of my time litigating federal FOIA lawsuits for journalists, including freelancers, including documentary filmmakers, and nonprofit newsrooms, and for-profit newsrooms. So feel free to contact me or the Reporters Committee as an additional resource. And one more thing on federal FOIA litigation. It's again, a little bit of a paradox in that sometimes filing a federal lawsuit can get you some records much more quickly. It's possible to go into court really on the 21st business day in some cases. And sometimes you can get a really good processing schedule from the court, and you can start getting productions. But there's also federal FOIA litigation that has literally been in the courts for decades and has not been resolved yet. Oftentimes, the agency drags its feet, and so you have to go brief everything before the court, and the court can take sometimes a long time to decide it. So filing litigation sometimes can be helpful, but also can be the start of a very long and protracted process. I have cases that have been going on for years. And it's frustrating as lawyers, and I'm sure it's much more frustrating as reporters who are just waiting, for their information.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think often the way this works is you won't hear anything. You'll file a lawsuit to get something. You will get a government attorney on the other side who eventually has to enter an appearance, and they might agree to some kind of production. So over the next several months, you'll start to get a trickle of records, but there will be redactions, there will be withholdings. And then the question is, do you want to move to briefing? And by the time you send a summary judgment briefing schedule and you wait for the judge to issue a decision and then the government might appeal, that can take years. But if you just want to make sure you get someone's attention, you will at least get someone's attention if you file a lawsuit. Sometimes, one of the last cases I did at the Times was for CDC demographic data about COVID cases. And that was exactly what Ron said, asking for a specific form, really clean FOIA requests, so huge amounts of data, but just one Excel spreadsheet. So that was relatively easy to produce. We got really lucky with a rocket docket judge in the Southern District of New York, and it moved extremely quickly. That's rare, but it sometimes happens.
Yeah, David McCraw, who's in-house counsel at the Times, who we both know, once said, filing a federal FOIA lawsuit is basically paying $400 to get a super FOIA officer. Someone who will actually just pay attention, as Alexandra said, to your request. And sometimes it's worth it. But again, it does take time and effort and money and an attorney to do that.
But I just would add here that you should always appeal. I mean, always, never give up your right to appeal a decision.
Yeah, Ron, that's so right. I think a lot of people don't file an appeal because they're like, oh, it's complicated, or I don't understand the law, or I don't think anything is going to happen. But if you look at the stats on administrative appeals, information is released in a huge percentage of cases even by filing a pretty perfunctory administrative appeal, because it requires a second person at the agency to look at it, and they find errors a huge number of times. So always file an administrative appeal. You have nothing to lose and only things to gain.
And you all touched on this when you guys talked, but if we could go over just like some best practices or some kind of things that you guys always stick to when describing the records that you're trying to get at through FOIA. What are some of like the best tips that you guys have, or something that has really stayed with you that you found has been most effective in the language that you're using when you're filing your FOIA?
I'll jump at that because my presentation was mostly about that. So I'll jump in first here, is that first know what you're looking for and be as specific as you can when you're describing the information, the documents, data, what have you that you're looking for. And the more you can do that, the more that you'll be able to get the likelihood that you'll get the information is greater, because the agency can't come back to you and say, well, that was overly broad. So can you narrow your request? So if I say to them that I'm looking for this particular report and here's the number of it, and here's the title of it, then yeah. Or even if I don't know the title of it, I can find out like what information was collected based on looking at the SORNs or the privacy impact assessments, and be able to say the information that was collected under this. So that gives you a greater opportunity, because again, they can't come back and just say that, well, we don't know what you're talking about, or that that's a really broad thing. And to reemphasize again, appealing, because some things are just ridiculously denied. I got a request once for, it was basically, I was looking at the fusion centers that the Department of Homeland Security has around the country that collects all this information. And they redacted out like percentages and numbers, which made absolutely no sense, like for law enforcement sensitivity. And you're like, because I know the percentage, that's gonna like jeopardize a case? I mean, like, really? And so I just appealed it. And I was at the Times at the time, and as you guys mentioned, I mean, Dave McCraw is one of the most aggressive, like, attorneys that I know. I once walked into Dave's office and he was saying, "You want to sue them?" I was like, "Dave, I'm just here to say hello, dude. I'm just here to say hello." But, in all seriousness, that's where I learned this from. Always appeal, always appeal, because you never know when somebody else at the agency will come and say, well, no, that was completely wrong. And that's what they did in our case around the fusion centers. They just looked at it and said, nah, and we'll get you the documents, because it was redaction for no apparent reason. The other thing is as I said, put your reporting skills to use as well. If you can't get the documents one place, look for other places to get those. And don't forget that, giving another example here, I was trying to get some stuff just about when the stimulus passed on the Obama administration. No Republicans voted for it, but several of them we had heard had asked for money for their states, even though they didn't vote for the thing. But Congress is not subject to FOIA, right? So I can't, but the agencies that provide the money are subject to FOIA. So I asked for any communications between members of Congress and that agency, and got a bunch of letters, like the former senator from Illinois, Mark Kirk, who railed against, the stimulus. But in his letters, he was asking for money for Illinois, saying, hey, we have this and we have that. So again, use your reporting tools and your reporting skills for FOIA too. As Alexandra said, this is not a separate process. FOIA is an integral part of what we do. We have to think about it the same way that we think about sources, right? Like, you would never go without like talking to your sources. And the same thing should apply here. This has to be built into our DNA.
I completely echo everything Ron said. A legal note on the how to describe records. I think it's a very tricky process. As Alexandra said, in her presentation, the standard is you have to reasonably describe the records you're after. And there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of FOIA cases trying to suss out exactly what that means. I think one important takeaway from that is that courts have said you cannot require FOIA officers to make a subjective uh, determination as to what you are interested in. So one way that plays out is in requests that ask for all records related to X, related to something, right? Courts have generally said that does not reasonably describe records because you're requiring the FOIA officer to say, well, is this related to that subject? Like, at some level of generality, everything in the federal government is related to everything else, right? And so the FOIA officer has no ability to say like, oh, well, maybe this is like close related, but maybe this is not so closely related. So do not use the words related to. One thing you can do that I think is really helpful is you can use keywords in describing the records you're after. The caveat here is that I would, again, try to focus it in as specifically as possible. So for example, if you're interested in, the emails of a cabinet level secretary, for example, you might say, okay, I want all emails, to or from the Secretary of State, between, during this week that mention the word octopus. That's a really great way of getting at something where you don't know whether it exists or not, right? Like, I don't know if the Secretary of State is talking about octopuses or not. But if he is talking about octopuses in his emails, I have now reasonably described the records I'm after without, again, knowing the specifics about what is being talked about. So keywords are one way to satisfy the reasonably described standard.
Alexandra, anything you want to add to that?
Cover the key points. Again, just remember that you're dealing with a human on the other side who, if you can make their lives easier, they are more inclined to refill your request more quickly. And if you have 24-point list of communications with A and or B and maybe including C, and it gets super convoluted, it's going to go to the bottom of their pile. So it doesn't mean you can't have, a potentially broad request, but something that give them clues of where to start, what custodian's email inboxes to search and what date range and all of that. And remember, Adam talked about the trends over time. Part of this is the volume of records that agencies have is now just so vast with everything happening by email. It is orders of magnitude more stuff out there. So the more you can, help them figure out what you want, the more quickly you will get it.
And I think some of the best journalists who incorporate FOIA into their reporting know that these things take a long time. And because of that, they put in a lot of requests to basically build up a pipeline. So, I like to think of FOIA requests kind of like fruit, and that they ripen at different speeds. And if you put in, a lot of different requests to a lot of different agencies, some of them are smaller requests, some of them are medium requests, some of them are bigger requests, they're all going to ripen at different times. And if you have enough in the system, eventually you're going to be at this place where you're getting back something, like every day or every other day. And, it might take a while to get to that point. But once you do, that's like great. You like open up your inbox every day and there's just stuff and you're like, this is amazing. I get to like look through it. So think about, and Ron said this too, but think about FOIA, as an integral part of your reporting. But it's a long-term project and not a breaking news tool.
Okay. Well, we're coming up here. It's almost 11:15, the end of our discussion. So I just want to see if you guys want to add anything or if we should close out. And also, if you guys haven't been following the discussion, it seems like Adam's cat, Phoebe, might be the breakout star of this discussion.
Yeah, Phoebe is a very adventurous and delightful creature. You know, she doesn't have a Twitter, so instead I'll just say follow me on Twitter if you want. Nothing but FOIA ramblings at a Marshall Plan. And please do visit the Reporters Committee if you all need help. We have a hotline that you can email or contact online through our web form. Someone will respond to you and get you information about whatever legal thing is troubling you.
And Ron and Alexandra, best way to reach you guys if anyone has any follow-up questions after this?
Oh, I put my email in the PowerPoint, but it's just rnixon@ap.org.
And mine you'll find if you Google me, I think, but a.perloff-giles@gibsondunn.com.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on a Saturday morning and having this discussion. We really appreciate it. And hopefully we've been able to answer some questions that you guys had. And we'll also try to get the PowerPoints out to you all. And a reminder, if you guys want to look back, there should be a recording of this discussion available to all participants, so you could kind of look back at it. So thank you, everyone, and have a good weekend.